sensors, Internet of Things, a whole set of changes in healthcare, which are probably as dramatic as the changes which brought us, textile mills and steam power and so on 200 years ago. That's why I think, despite all the hype and exaggeration and so on, it's correct to be discussing these issues. But the other reason why it matters is if you read your history books, of course, although these long-run trends were incredibly positive for human well-being, if you were around in the first decades of the Industrial Revolution, life was not just grim, it was awful. I mean, in this area, in Manchester, the other cities which grew up with industrialization, they were associated with impoverishment, immiserization, appalling health, appalling crime, appalling inequality, which was documented at the time, is why Marx and Engels expected the immiserization of the working classes to fuel revolution. And it was only because in the second half of the 19th century, a whole load of people invented new innovations, social innovations, political innovations, to deal with it, that life became better. Those included public sewers, universal education, universal democracy and suffrage, later a welfare state, an NHS. All of these institutions were essential, were political innovations to ensure that the power of those technologies actually led to good effects for everyone, not just for a tiny minority. And I think we're entering a very similar period around the Fourth Industrial Revolution, where the sense that the energy of the technologies is in some ways fairly clear, dominated by a fairly small number of actors, and the political discussion about what equivalent innovations will we need in the next 20 or 30 years so we will benefit, that has hardly started. And it's hardly started partly because of a problem we have with political leadership. I've never known a time in this country when political leadership has felt so completely anachronistic. And it's not just about chronological age, that party leaders are all older than ever before, I think. It's the mindsets as well. I was active in the Labour Party as a teenager, and the current policies and the people are the same, and the policies are exactly the same as when I was a teenager. Theresa May's Tory party is not exactly projecting an imaginative vision of where we could be in 10 or 20 years' time. There's a massive deficit of leadership here and in many parts of the world. There is a drift to nostalgia. It's not coincidence that the language of take back control, make America great again, is so strong in politics. People are afraid of the future. They see the sort of cityscape you can see from here and read about automation and so on, and basically assume their children will be worse off than them. Again, first time that's been true for quite a while. So establishing a coherent political account of the future is hard, is not being done by the mainstream institutions at all, and into that space is filled by fear, by stigmatization, etc. And in particular, fairly obviously to this group, the first half of the last century was in many ways dominated by people responding to an earlier phase of industrial revolution and globalization by building walls and barriers and reasserting the nation state and racial superiority and so on. We then spent the second half of the 20th century trying to break those down, whether the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall, or trade barriers or communication barriers, and now there is a very powerful political trend to rebuild them. Not just Trump, but also in different ways. Modi, Xi, Abe are all part of a reassertion of classic big man authoritarian power, reasserting the nation as the only vehicle for human welfare. So there is a job to be done. I'm just going to talk about three little vignettes of elements of political response from around the world, then finish by saying a bit about some of the things we're involved in here, and then hopefully we can tear that apart. So one of the things I've been doing the last year or so is, with the World Economic Forum, chairing one of their councils on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And this is a group from around the world, mainly involved in business, investment, technology, and so on. What's very clear is we all have a pretty strong consensus that the current direction of the 4IR is seriously problematic in at least three ways. First of all, in terms of the purposes of the investment. Most of it is being driven by military spending, all over the world, still the case. And within business, a very high proportion of the investment is for what are frankly pretty trivial tasks like improving YouTube recommendation engines. The amount of brain power and money directed to using these new tools for health or education or to deal with poverty or refugee integration is tiny, absolutely tiny as a percentage of the global whole. So we're arguing for a shift of really the purposes of this revolution. Secondly, to open up participation in shaping it. Again, there are lots of pockets of invention around the world in the heart of big companies like Facebook or Google or Huawei, in some universities, in some government bodies, in some military bodies, but this is a revolution on which the great majority of the population are observers, passive observers. So opening up participation in terms of everything from maker spaces and business accelerators and social innovation programs, we think is a really urgent priority. And of course the two issues are linked. And thirdly, we are seeing a lot of the current digital technologies essentially amplifying the worst of human nature, not the best. They are already amplifying our tendencies to addictive, compulsive behaviors, to hostility and hatred, rather than amplifying the good of human nature. So we're arguing for three sort of big shifts in how this revolution is organized and articulated. The two other little vignettes I'll give are of places where I think that's happening. So last week I was in Korea. I chair a sort of committee for the mayor of Seoul, which is doesn't look actually unlike this, so the weather was better. But he's a radical mayor elected from an NGO background who is trying to maintain Seoul's position as the most technologically advanced city on earth, but also with very strong citizen engagement and decision making. They're right on the forefront of direct digital democracy, which we could talk about, which as Nesta we've been doing a lot of work on across Europe, and also what they call Internet of Things test beds, opening up really the shaping of this revolution to hundreds of thousands of people, big data academies and centres, and a whole load of stuff. I've seen nothing like that in Britain. It's really striking how there's this great political energy to deal with the issues you're talking about here, but no mayor in Britain, no minister has uttered anything remotely comparable, to the best of my knowledge, but I'd love to be proven wrong. The second example is Finland, where I also work with the Finnish government and Sitra, their foundation. They too are trying to create within Finland, again, was laboratories of the 4IR future. They have one which is all about smart and clean technologies. How do you shape driverless cars, drones, new kinds of building, etc., to dramatically cut carbon, to be a zero carbon city in the near future. Very creative combination of public sector, business, universities, but all around very real live experiments which anyone can come and see. Again, we've got little bits of that here in Britain, but nothing of a comparable coherence and ambition. And the other thing they're looking at, like us, in some ways in the UK, is health. What does this all mean for health when you have dramatically stronger sources of data, predictive tools, and the ability to personalise and manage your own health? Now, all of these, in a way, I think are just the sort of the pointers to what a much more, in some ways, ambitious politics of the 4IR should be. And I'll end just with one, I think, sort of unifying theme of this, which may be a statement of the bleeding obvious to an audience like this. But it's become very clear in the last 20 or 30 years that one of the features of a much more knowledge-based economy, an economy much more based on creativity, etc., is that it tends to widen divisions. The gap between the most dynamic cities and the average city, between the biggest firms and the average firm, between the globalized beneficiaries of an open labour market and the average worker. I live in Luton, where I see this very clearly, because most of my neighbours are very much not part of the kind of networks which meet in places like this. They are the people feeling they're the slow and the faster hurtling ahead. So the biggest political question, really, of the next 10 or 20 years, comparable to the political challenge of the mid-19th century, which was about, say, new institutions, etc., is how do you stop the sort of knowledge economy being contained being just concentrated in a few small pockets. How do you make sure everyone can take part in it, every SME, every region? And there's a lot of work happening globally trying to turn that into programmatic form. What does that mean for schooling? What does it mean for apprenticeships? What does it mean for welfare systems? What does it mean for, well, again, sort of healthcare, etc.? There isn't time to talk about all of that, but that to me is the great agenda. And in a way, history is our guide, because in East London, in fact, the sort of second half of the 19th century, early 20th century was a period of extraordinary success in building the social and political institutions fit for making the Industrial Revolution something which was good for the majority of the people. That was by no means guaranteed in sort of 1860, 1870, 1880, but it was achieved through a huge amount of activism, experiment, a very dynamic civil society, which made this area actually not a bad place to live. We need you to be really the equivalents of those for this fourth industrial revolution. Otherwise, it's not very hard to paint the scenarios where it all goes horribly wrong. I was standing on the North Korean border 8 days ago, imagining Donald Trump, you know, and what could go wrong there. So I think I will just end with Martin Luther. This is Martin Luther's 500th anniversary this week, isn't it? Of nailing the theses on the door. Do you know the very famous quote from Martin Luther, which came into my head standing on the border with North Korea last week? He said, if I can remember it rightly, even if you think the world is going to come to an end tomorrow, you should still plant your apple tree today. That's probably what we have to do. Even if we fear apocalyptic visions at the 4 hour, let's nevertheless make sure we're part of the solution, not part of the problem.